Now we come to the very first episode of Series 4 I ever saw as a kid. You Can't Win, based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book Duke the Lost Engine. This is also the final time Duke would get a major appearance in the show. Any other appearances he had after this would just be cameos, so was this one a high note for Duke to go out on? Duke is the hero of Sodor. Long ago, when Peter Sam and Sir Handel were known as Stuart and Falcon, holidaymakers would visit his old line every year. They would not only visit the lakes and the mountains, but they would mainly see Duke himself. With knowledge of all the best picnic spots, he would take visitors wherever they wanted to go and would cheerfully whistle a reminder to be back in time to be collected so that they don't miss their boat back to the mainland. Duke never wished to disappoint the holidaymakers, and so would pull his trains even if he was unwell. One day, Duke was feeling short of steam, so he rested while his crew cleaned his tubes. Stuart arrived and teased Duke, telling him that they would have to keep an eye on him in case he breaks down. Duke stormed off in a huff, but soon felt better as he made his evening run. As he began to climb the hill, however, he suddenly felt short of steam again and his valves began leaking. Duke realised the journey would not be as easy as he initially thought, but struggled on until he reached the next station, where his driver checked him over whilst the anxious passengers waited for news. The guard informed them that Stuart and Falcon would help Duke reach the harbour in time. The two engines coupled onto the train, Falcon in front of Duke and Stuart at the back, behind the brake van, and they set off. Falcon took the boat train on his own at the next station, while Stuart was coupled in front of Duke. Stuart was excited about rescuing a broken down Duke and teased him as they set off, but unbeknownst to Stuart, Duke's valves sounded worse than they actually were and he still had plenty of steam. He and his driver decided to play a trick on Stuart, and when they reached the next hill, Duke suddenly put all his effort into pulling the train, making a loud echoing racket as he did so and catching Stuart by surprise. The two engines soon reached the last station and the passengers cheered loudly. A boy waiting at the platform asked his father why there were two engines pulling the train. Misunderstanding the situation, the man assumed that Stuart was the broken down engine and Duke had to help him, not the other way around. Stuart, realising he had been tricked, angrily disappeared in a cloud of steam while Duke enjoyed his victory, telling him you can't win. For the final story for Duke to appear in before he was just reduced to cameos and then never appearing again after the 4th series, I think this was a really good note for Duke to go out on, even if we did want him to appear in other stories as a main character. But this really was a good way to end his story. And this was the only episode based on a story from Duke's book, not to be told by Thomas or any of the other standard gauge engines. However, like the other 3 episodes, it's presented as a flashback, and I absolutely admire all of the sceneries for this episode, mostly by the lakes and the mountains, and especially that forest view. They just positioned the camera at such a great angle. I don't think they could have made the shot any better than this. Just getting to see the overview of all the trains and the railway line. It's just a gorgeous shot. Most of the themes in this episode by Michael Donnell and Junior Campbell are all renditions of the Skarloey Railway theme, but my favourite theme from this episode by far is the Viaduct theme from Series 3. They do a brand new rendition of it where it's a little shorter. It starts off normally like previous versions of the theme, but then it gets a little more suspenseful as the theme goes on, before ending like a sigh of relief. Another great rendition of this classic theme. And there's a huge difference in the book when you compare it to the TV episode. At the end of the book, when Stuart realises he'd been tricked by Duke, he shouts, "Well, for crying out loud!" Whereas in the televised episode he shouts, "Fiddlesticks!" I can only assume that this was done to be a little bit more suitable for a children's audience, since for crying out loud isn't a phrase you would normally hear in children's shows. Well, children's shows made for younger viewers anyway, so it makes sense to them to change it to Fiddlesticks at the time, while still keeping true to the story. And like how the previous story, Bulldog, mainly focused on Falcon, this story mainly focused on Stuart, showing off his cheeky and boastful personality. And Michael Angelis does the perfect voice for Stuart, making him sound like an annoying little kid who thinks he knows best for Grandpuff.
"Hello, Grandpuff," he teased. "Are you short of puff?" "Nothing of the sort. This is routine maintenance." "Tell you what, went on Stuart. "You're getting old. We must take care of you in case you break down. Fancy me rescuing Grandpuff. This is the day, this is the day," he boasted. "Poor old engine, poor old engine."
It's just another wonderful performance from Michael. And it doesn't sound too annoying that it aches your ears. It's just the right amount of annoying and youthfulness. And a very funny goof in the episode is when Duke wears Falcon aka Sir Handel's angry face. It happens when the cavalcade splits up with Falcon taking passengers to the boat and Stuart heading the next train with Duke behind him. And because this was the very first episode of Series 4 I ever saw, I just automatically thought that this was Duke's natural angry face. And it wasn't until I watched Steamroller afterwards that I found out that it actually belongs to Sir Handel. It's just a very funny goof that cracks me up every time I rewatch the episode. And as I said in the beginning of this video, this was actually the very first episode of the 4th series I ever watched as a kid. It was the very first story featured on Thomas and Stepney and Other Stories VHS tape. And this was my introduction to the 4th series as well as Duke and the other narrow gauge engines. And as a first introduction to the 4th series, it still holds up to this day in my opinion. It's a fun way to wrap up Duke's story for the TV series, and it gets us all set up to hear the rest of the stories from the narrow gauge railway. It's definitely a fun episode that I recommend checking out if you haven't checked it out already or haven't seen it in years. You definitely won't be disappointed with Duke's final major appearance. And of course this didn't spell the end of the narrow gauge stories, there would be plenty more to come.
Well, for crying out loud.